Hi, everybody. Jake Cunningham here. Check out this interview I did in 2011 with Gregg Braden. And I know you'll gain some huge value from it because the information is as relevant today, if not more, than it was then. Enjoy, and please feel free to share this with the world. Greg, thank you so much for being with us today. My first question for you is, how did you come up with the name for your book, Deep Truth?
Well, Jake, I want to tell you I'm thrilled to be on this program, and I'm very excited to be with our listeners. It's a great place to start today, and actually this book, Deep Truth, the full title is Deep Truth, Igniting the Memory of Our Origin, History, Destiny, and Fate. One of the things that's so interesting about this book, Jake, it's the first time, generally, when I write a book, a title is selected, and then the book is written to that title so that we're always on track with the content. This book was very different. The book was almost finished before the title was ever selected. I didn't know what it was going to be called. And one of the first things I discovered when we released the book in November was that the word truth in a title of a book means different things to different people. And for some people, it's actually a bit of a charged word. There were people that felt it was presumptuous for me to write a book entitled The Deep Truth.
Right,
So
right.
I'd like to begin the conversation today just sharing with our listeners how that title came about and where it came from. It actually comes from a conversation between two of the great minds, my idols in the 20th century, two physicists, Albert Einstein and a colleague of his, Niels Bohr. The two of them were friends as well as colleagues, and they were having a conversation one day about the nature of truth, and in this case, the nature of scientific truth. And this was in the mid-20th century. It's like every week there were new papers being published, new discoveries that were changing what it was that had been held to be the deepest truths of science. So the deep truths of science were changing very quickly in the mid-20th century. And Niels Bohr made a statement, and I'm just going to share. It's a single sentence. Statement was simply this. He said, "It is the hallmark of any deep truth that its negation is also a deep truth," end of quote. And when I read that, I thought, well, first thing I said, wow, that's really deep. And I thought it's so profound because what he was saying, Jake, is that when new discoveries overturn what we have held to be the deepest truths of our lives and our existence, then those new discoveries themselves become the new deep truths. And I said that has got to be the title for this book, and here's the reason why. The best minds of our time are telling us today in no uncertain terms that we are living a unique time, a time unlike any in 5,000 years of recorded human history. They say that we're facing the greatest number of crises, and that each crisis is of the greatest magnitude ever faced by a single generation, and never have so many big problems needed to be solved in such a brief period of time. Some of the issues we're dealing with have to be solved, the crises. We've got to find solutions in the next 12 to 18 months. So the new discoveries that we're talking about, this is the good news. New scientific discoveries are overturning many of what were held to be the deepest truths about us, how long we've been in this world, where we come from, our relationship to ourselves and to our past, and how things work, whether or not we compete or cooperate in this world. The new discoveries are overturning many of the old ideas that are steeped. You and I, our listeners, and many young people there are steeped in these that are now called false assumptions of science. That's the good news. We would think everybody would be happy about that. The flip side of the good news is that there's a reluctance in the mainstream media, and in some cases, Jake, there's an outright resistance to sharing these new discoveries in mainstream television, mainstream documentaries, mainstream classrooms, mainstream textbooks. And I'm going to be very clear when I know many of our listeners are in the United States and some of them are not. So what I'm going to say applies to the United States specifically. In the United States of America, every state determines the curricula for what can and cannot be taught by the teachers of that state in the classroom. So even when new discoveries are made and they're published in peer-reviewed journals and accepted as the new science, unless the school board approves that curricula, that teachers cannot share that material. So the reason I'm saying this is it's not the teacher's fault. Now, I don't want people to, right. I don't want to leave that impression. Where this leaves us in context is so important. Here we are facing huge crises. How we deal with climate change, for example, how we deal with the disappearance of vital resources, fresh water, clean food, the growing disparity in economics between tremendous poverty and tremendous wealth, the growing disparity between education and illiteracy, and many other things, how we deal with 7 billion people all needing the basics of life. The way we answer those questions in the past has been through the false assumptions of science that I'm going to identify here in just a moment. And because they were based on unsustainable principles, they've led to the crises that we're experiencing today. The new discoveries that could help us actually remedy many of these crises before any more suffering, human suffering occurs. The information simply isn't getting out there. So young people today in school, for example, are being asked, and many of our experts are being asked to solve the problems with the same false assumptions that led to the crises themselves. So when I understood that, I said deep truth has got to be the name of this book. And what I've done in the book is I've identified 5 key assumptions that all of us were led to believe were true when we were in school. They're still being taught to our young people in schools today. Identify those assumptions and then share the new discoveries that tell us where those assumptions are incomplete or in some cases outright false, and then where that leads us. So Jake, if it's okay with you, what I'd like to do, we want to hear from our listeners later in the program, but I'd like to identify those 5 false assumptions, maybe zero in on 1 or 2 that I think are wreaking the greatest havoc today, and let's see where that leads us.
I think the analogy from the book that I got out of it, I want to just mention it, we can translate this into the work we do today with the analogy of cooperation, and don't take the false assumptions from the medical community that we are supposed to buy into from mainstream media. But no, please, Greg, take it away.
That's precisely where we're going to go with this, and then we'll zero in on this idea of competition versus cooperation. It actually opens the door to all the other assumptions, but let's work with that a little bit today. So what I'd like to do, there are many false assumptions in science, and I selected 5 that in my opinion, I feel have separated us to the greatest degree from life, from the way we think of ourselves, our relationship to ourselves, our relationship to our own bodies, our relationship to the earth, our relationship to history and our past, and certainly our relationship to others as we go through everyday life. So with that in mind, I chose 5, and the book is all based in peer-reviewed science. It's not speculation, it's not hypothesis, it's not theory. These are scientific facts, been published, reviewed by other scientists. They're accepted in specific realms of the scientific community. They're accepted. But the scientific community does not have a voice with a broad general public. So when scientists, just for example, when scientists are not on board with the mainstream thinking about climate change, many of those scientists simply don't have a way to share their information with the mainstream. The media doesn't respect it. The media doesn't pick it up. So I've tried to give some of those scientists a voice here as well. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to simply state 5 key assumptions of science. When I was in school in the 60s and 70s, these were taught. In fact, they were taught most of our listeners today, and if our listeners have young people in school, these are being taught today. So the first one, no surprise, is an assumption based on Charles Darwin's theories. It is about evolution. So the key assumption number one is that evolution explains life in general and human life specifically. The problem with that is that the data simply does not support it. Peer-reviewed scientific facts simply tell us that evolution in and of itself, the way Darwin stated it, cannot explain the human existence. Evolution is a fact in other forms of life, and as a geologist, a former geologist, I can tell you we see it in the fossil record. For some plants, animals, and insects, we don't see it for humans. It doesn't explain human life. Key assumption number two is about civilization. When I was in school, our young people are in school today, we were taught that civilization began about 5,000 years ago. It's only 5,000 years old. It's linear. It's happened essentially once from primitive to the sophisticated technology that we see today. Again, the problem with that is the data simply does not support it. New discoveries, peer-reviewed science-based discoveries are now confirming advanced civilizations over twice this old in the end of the last ice age. And while we probably won't talk much about this today, I want our listeners to know I have images from the Smithsonian Institution that they've allowed me to share with our live audiences. So you'll see some of the archaeological sites pushing the date of advanced civilization back over 11,500 years.
Nice. That's great. That's great. I'm
yeah.
looking forward to it.
I'm very excited. It's a very visual program and very fast moving. I'm excited to share it. So key assumption number three is based on, it's a physics assumption that consciousness is somehow separate from our physical world. And what I know is that if people are listening to this program, we know that consciousness is not separate from, consciousness is the stuff that our physical world is derived from. New discoveries in quantum physics are telling us that this is the way the universe works. And great minds like Professor John Wheeler, Princeton University, a colleague of Albert Einstein's, he was very on board with the fact that we are part of rather than separate from the universe around us. But this is still being taught in school, that consciousness is separate from our physical world, and it relates to the next key assumption, that the space between physical things is empty. And of course, I think if you're on this call, we all know there is no empty space. There is something everywhere. The stuff that we used to think was the empty space simply is a form of energy that our equipment has not been designed to detect. And science, for 300 years, science has said if you can't see it, you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And that leaves a whole lot of the universe unexplored and unacknowledged. So that's number four. Number five is another Darwinian assumption based on Charles Darwin's observations. And the assumption is that nature is based upon what he called survival of the strongest. It was later interpreted as survival of the fittest. This is such a dangerous way of thinking. The problem is that peer-reviewed scientific studies are showing us absolutely, 400 peer-reviewed scientific studies are showing us that while competition may happen sometimes in nature, we're all aware of that, we've certainly seen it, that it is not the fundamental model that nature is based upon. Nature is based upon a model of cooperation and what is called mutual aid rather than competition and survival of the strongest. So if you're taking notes, then you wrote each of those down at the top, if you'll write false assumptions and then put a big X through every one of them, because it's not theory, it's not hypothesis, it's not a Gregg-ism. These are, every one of these categorically peer-reviewed, scientifically now are accepted as being false, and they're still being taught in the classrooms today. Mainstream still buys into many of these, and it is that belief that has led us to the unsustainable ways of life that are collapsing, creating the crises that we're living now. So I just wanted to get that was a lot of information. I wanted to get it out early in the program, and now we can tie into those and we can talk about some of these. And if you'd like, Jake, I'd love to start with that number 5. And
please
and
do.
just talk about that a
Competition,
little bit.
because in terms of competition, it's being an athlete all my life and seeing my generation of highly hyper-competitive in the physical and mental in terms of business, and then we're seeing it today in the politics. Where is the line? Where is the balance between healthy play, fun, competition that drives and inspires us to falling over that that tipping point?
Yeah, it's a beautiful place to begin, Jake, and I'm going to make that distinction right now. When biologists are talking about competition, they're talking about what is called violent competition. So this isn't a friendly game of checkers or a game of soccer. This is violent competition. And what I'm going to get ahead of myself just a little bit, and I want to refine this idea. There is a subtle yet powerful difference between an individual developing their abilities to the greatest degree that is possible for themselves, and there's a distinction I'm making between us being our personal best and us exploiting the weakness of others to benefit. Okay, and that's the kind of competition that nature is not based upon. So our young people in school today, for example, this idea of survival of the strongest, it comes across in a lot of ways. It's so, even very conscious people who think they are beyond this, what they have found in the studies is that this idea of survival of the strongest is so deeply ingrained into our culture and our subconscious. It comes up in ways that we may not even be consciously aware of. But if you're listening to this call, you're in a generation, as I am, we're in this together. We were pretty much taught we live in what's called a dog-eat-dog world. That is the vernacular.
Right.
And it is based on, I'm just going to go back. I'm going to talk about Charles Darwin a little bit. Darwin was a scientist, and I'm not down on Darwin. I think he was probably a pretty good scientist. Mm-hmm. In my opinion, this is where Darwin went wrong. He, in the mid-1800s, 1830s through 1850s, he made a series of journeys into the wild and recorded his observations. And where I believe he made the mistake was he took some observations that he made for some forms of life in some parts of the world, and he tried to generalize them to apply to all life everywhere. And the problem is the data doesn't support it, and especially when it comes to humans, the data doesn't support it. So here's why Darwin's work is so important. In the mid-1800s, up until the mid-1800s, when Darwin released his first book, it was titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, science had not attempted to answer the big questions of life. It was done through the church, through religion, largely the Catholic Church. Big questions like where do we come from, how do we get here, how do things work once we are here. So Darwin was the first scientist that tried to answer these big questions of life. And he did it based on his own observations, and because what he published in his book in 1859, because it was based on the best science of that time, his ideas were very quickly embraced. They weren't questioned very much. They were quickly embraced. They became deeply entrenched. And if we think about our lives in our world today, yeah, we live in the 21st century, but our civilization is largely based on ideas that developed the late 1800s, early 1900s, and Darwin has been a big part of that. So one of the observations Darwin made was when he saw certain behavior patterns in insects or animals in the wild in one place, what he said was he believed that he was looking at one example in that place of a law that applies to all life everywhere. So for example, when he would see two birds in a nest that were siblings, and another bird would come along that was different, the siblings would kick that bird out just because it was different and leave it to die. Or he saw colonies of ants where larger colonies of ants would actually capture and enslave smaller colonies. They didn't kill them. They made them work for them so that they could do other things with their lives. So Darwin saw these, and he interpreted them as little examples in nature of a general law that applies to all of us. And that law, he said, is the we've all heard this before, is for us to multiply, vary, let the strongest live, and the weakest die. That's a direct quote from Darwin. Let the strongest live, and the weakest die. Well, this is a very dangerous way of thinking. And if we want to see the consequences of where this line of thinking can lead in their extreme, we need look no further than the unsustainable ways of life that we've created for ourselves today. Many of the crises we're facing are based in these ideas of Darwin, that the corporations, as they have developed in our world today, are largely based on survival of the strongest. They're not about what's good for people, they're about what's good for the corporation. Our young people in school are entrenched into their minds to excel at all costs, or at any cost, to get the right answer on the test at any cost, to score the point on the playing field at any cost. The economic system of the world that is collapsing before our eyes right now, we're looking at the economic system going through the final throes of unsustainability. It's collapsing because it is unsustainable, and it's based on this idea of false assumption of survival of the strongest. So all of these, if people are asking, and I hear this a lot, they say, okay, Greg, we get it. Darwin wasn't 100% accurate, but, it was 1859. What difference could that possibly make in our lives today? I'm sharing some of those answers with you, and now that we've emerged from the 20th century, what we're seeing is that the greatest acts of atrocity, of human against human, and the largest degrees of suffering and the genocides of the 20th century, and some of them are continuing today, the leaders of the nations who are approving the genocides actually base them in Darwin's theory. They say it's science. Darwin said that the inferior members don't deserve to survive, and so these leaders or organizations, they determine who is inferior. And all of this, it all helps us to understand how dangerous a false assumption of science and empowering that science in our lives the way we have, where that can lead.
I want to state something and how powerful, why not only bringing a new perspective on history in terms of breaking the mold, but why history is so important, obviously, to learn and not repeat it. But an example is my mother's side of the family came from Russia during the Holocaust and escaped. They made it out. The Holocaust is an example, I think, of what you're stating, and an example of that extreme. And I saw a documentary the other day on the youth generation, the documentary called 180, but it talks about the Holocaust, and it interviewing young people who forgot and don't know what it is. And if they do, some of them thought it was a hoax, meaning it didn't happen. And that's, I think, a lesson of why we need to understand the bigger picture and not forget about these lessons, just as we need to learn what foods are good for us and what isn't, and so we don't repeat the pattern. But go ahead, I interrupted.
No, you actually, it's right in line. I just came back from a business trip 2 days ago in South Florida, and I took an afternoon. My wife and I went to a Holocaust museum, and what really struck me from the experience was the parallels, Jake, between what happened leading up to the Holocaust in the early 20th century with the economy, with the thinking, with the bias, and the way people were treated, and where we find ourselves in the world today. The parallels are striking. I'm not saying it has to happen the same way. I'm saying that the patterns appear to repeat in very specific ways.
This next crisis isn't anything external. It's us. And I think that's one form of us.
Precisely. And this is where now any of this, it's interesting. It would be important, to know about it at any time. But now I'm going to come back to the context. Here we are, the best minds of our time, scientists, engineers, philosophers, political leaders, social architects, religious leaders, they're all telling us in their own way that we are in crisis. Now, the word crisis, I used to have an aversion to it, and I actually appreciate it now, Jake, because if we're in crisis, it means it's not over yet. It means we have time to do something to remedy what it is that's calling to us for our attention. So the fact that we are in crisis, I think, is actually a blessing in some respects, because it brings to our attention that where our thinking, the false assumptions have led us, and the new discoveries help us to know how we can apply new, deeper truths to the solutions. So while what we're talking about, Darwin's ideas or any of the other ideas, the false assumptions, they'd be important anytime, they're critical now because of the context. If we're going to solve these problems, the greatest crises, 5,000 years of human history, what all of the leaders are telling us is we've got to think differently than we have ever thought before, and we've got to change the way that we have been led to think very, very quickly. In the West, science is a language that's trusted and respected. Other cultures don't need the science. When I'm with the monks and the nuns in Tibet, and we will visit those, and I have those documented images I'll share with the Congress. We'll go into the intimate settings of the monasteries and the nunneries. They don't need the science or the indigenous traditions throughout the world, but the big power structures, I think, is where the change is going to come from. And what I found, Jake, is that people are willing to change if they're given a good reason. They're not just going to flip-flop back and forth and invest in change for no reason, but people will invest their hearts, their minds, their energy, their thinking, their resources into new ways of thinking when they have a good reason to do so. And these discoveries, that's why they're important. A responsible reason or a solid reason to responsibly make the changes to minimize the suffering that comes from the collapse of so many unsustainable ways of life, all in the same period of time. So that's just one of the assumptions. This was the Darwinian assumption: nature is based on survival of the strongest. But the two biggest crises looming on the horizon right now directly tied to this. One is the collapse of the global economy, and the other one is a big war. I think we all sense there's a big war looming on the horizon in the Middle East. False assumption is that war is going to pull the global economy out of the tank, that war is good for business. And what they're missing is that peace is a viable industry, and that peace can actually take us far beyond where war can take us. I talk about this in the book. I think we're living in a time where war actually will become obsolete because it no longer serves the purpose it has in the past. Wars in the past were over boundaries that were clearly defined. The idea was that the winner would have something of value at the end of the war. They would have land or something like that. The kind of wars we're talking about now, everybody loses. And they're wars that are based more on ideas than they are on physical boundaries or of nations. So all of this stems back to these ideas, the false assumption of Darwin's. Now the flip side, and I want to say this quickly, the good news, over 400 peer-reviewed studies in the late 20th, now early 21st century have all asked the same question: what is the optimum amount of competition in any environment? And 400 peer-reviewed studies came back with the same answer, Jake. They all said zero. They said whether we're in the classroom, in the playing field, in the workplace, with the family, in the community, the optimal amount of competition is zero. Competition always, always, always is destructive for the individual and the community. The very prestigious journal, New Scientist, a gentleman named Michael LePage, published a beautiful article, culmination of many studies, April 2008. And what he said, and this is a quote, he said that what we see in nature is not every animal for itself, is not every animal for itself. He said that cooperation is an incredibly successful survival strategy, and that when cooperation breaks down, the results can be disastrous. And a beautiful example of this, if people want to see right now a perfect example of how fundamental cooperation is in nature, we need look no further than our own bodies. The human body, a single body isn't really an individual. We're actually a community of about 50 trillion cells that must cooperate on many levels to give us life as we know it today. And it's one of the most beautiful examples. My my dear, dear colleague, spiritual brother, and close friend, Dr. Bruce Lipton. We toured together through Australia and through Europe by train. And we had this conversation a lot. And Bruce is so very clear about the role of community in our bodies. So if there's any doubt that cooperation is I'm not saying that competition doesn't happen. It does in response to some circumstances, and we'll talk about those in the Congress. The key is nature is not based upon a model, survival of the strongest. Nature is based upon a model of cooperation, what's called mutual aid. And that changes everything about the way we solve the great crises of our time. So, and you mentioned, Jake, what I stated, the greatest crises that face us now are all things that we have the ability to change, that we have control over. We're looking at, an asteroid coming to the Earth that we have no control over or little control over, or that, we're looking at a supernova, solar flares from the sun or something like that.
Right.
When we talk about collapsing economies and the suffering of hundreds of millions of people, or we talk about the kind of war that is brewing right now in the Middle East, we have time to change that, our thinking and the way we deal with those. And whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. We've got time, and now is the time. So I know I just covered a lot of ground. I've spoken quickly, and it was kind of a dense amount of information, but I wanted to lay out this framework so that whatever we do and whatever questions come in from our listeners now, we can tie into these ideas and do it in a really responsible way. So thank you for the opportunity of just sharing all this before we go any further.
We are very, very privileged, and we feel blessed. So I don't want to say we feel entitled or privileged. We are grateful. And as I want to encourage everybody on to ask questions at this time on the chat online, and we'll facilitate a few of those before the top of the hour when Gregg needs to get going and we all need to move on and take action. But I had a written quote out of the book that I thought was beautiful by Bruce, your good friend and colleague Bruce Lipton, and it's a beautiful way to look at our role and how we cooperate in this place called Earth. And it's a quote that stated, "Everything on Earth is part of the garden, including us. Mother Earth has a way of dealing with things that don't fit into the garden. They're kicked out." And then goes on to say, "Either we figure out how to live in peace in nature's garden and take care of it, or we will be turned into mulch to feed the rest of the garden." And I thought it was pretty profound, putting it all in perspective.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is one of the places where I can share the personal element of that. Bruce and I, just the two of us, no entourage or anything, we were on tour through the German-speaking countries in Europe, and we opted to do it by train. We both prefer train to flying. Beautiful landscaping, and we could see the countryside, kick back, and talk to one another. And I asked Bruce this question. I was asking about competition, cooperation. We talked for hours about it. And when I asked him, I said, well, what happens if we don't cooperate? And this is what I couldn't convey in the book. He's got this little smile and a twinkle in his eye that he had when he shared that quote. He says, "We're all going to turn into mulch." And
Right.
What he was referring to is in the biological sciences, specifically evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biologists, they don't all agree on everything, but what they do agree upon is that there have been 5 mass extinctions of life on planet Earth in the past, and that we are right now deep into what is called the 6th mass extinction. Question is whether or not humans are part of that extinction, and we are determining that through the choices that we make in our lives today. So that was part of what Bruce was sharing with me.
Gregg, thank you. I encourage everybody to, go to your local bookstore, find Deep Truth. I unfortunately went to the library here locally, and they didn't have it. So I actually turned them on to carry your books, and I hope they listen. Again, that's a local small public library here, but also check out some of the audiobooks. That helped me actually wrap up the book on time, Greg.
The book is
Listen
so
to you.
new, I'm not surprised it's not in the libraries. It was only released in late October of last year. When I did the audio recording, it's my voice, and my publisher, Hay House, very supportive, just a great publisher. I couldn't ask for a better publisher. Typically, what they do is they take a book and they ask that the audio recording be abridged. And the abridgment reduces the book to 4 CDs, which fit the model for CD spoken word in places like Barnes and Noble and Hastings Books, and commercial bookstores.
Mm-hmm.
So they asked me to reduce this to 4 CDs. So we went into the studio, recorded the whole book, and then they went back to edit it. And the most amazing thing happened. The editors all came back and they said, this book should not be abridged. They said, if we take anything out, it takes away from this very powerful message. So they left the book unabridged. On the cover, it says abridged because they did not include photographs. And so the photograph is the part of the book that is not in that recording or in the booklet. But
Right.
Every word of the book, I spoke every word myself in the studio, and it is essentially the full book.
I'll tell you, I encourage that way of learning for all. Now, we all learn differently, of course, but to be taught while reading the words of the book and have it follow, I'm talking about full absorption other than seeing and hearing and learning from you live. So it was truly just a pleasure, and you really represent the by giving you receive, and the more you give, the more you share, the more you benefit, and that goes to all of our practitioners. The more people you help and the more people you serve, the more success comes your way, and that's really what this is all about. There's a question, Greg, real quick. I want to, if you can just quickly review, there's been a few questions from our audience asking what are the 5 deep truths or the false assumptions again?
I'll just go through them very quickly, and I'll preface it by saying every one of these is peer-reviewed, scientifically accepted as being false in the scientific circles. The mainstream is where the reluctance and the resistance to share this is coming from. Mainstream classrooms, textbooks, media, documentaries, television specials, things like that. So I'll just run through these 5. The key assumptions. Number 1, that evolution explains life in general and human life specifically. Number 2, that civilization began about 5,000 years ago. It is linear and it happened one time. Number 3, that consciousness is separate, somehow separate from our physical world. Number 4, that the space between things is empty. And number 5, that nature is based upon a model that Darwin called survival of the strongest, later interpreted as survival of the fittest. Every one of those are being taught in classrooms and textbooks. They were when I was in school. They are with our young people today. Every one of them is categorically, scientifically proven in peer-reviewed documentaries, peer-reviewed studies. Every one of these is false. So just put a big X through them.
You stated think differently. That was an old actual gentleman who recently passed, who left a significant mark on our planet, named Steve Jobs. Had a campaign for his company when he returned to Apple called Think Different, Think Differently. And I don't know if you recall that ad. And
I do, very, very much, yeah.
What you're doing, what this is doing, I feel we need to create a world that thinks differently. And there's so many great examples in the book, but also that we see daily, that if people, and let's translate this to our practitioners and the work they do. Continue to think differently. Let's continue to ask the tough questions, because this continual search for who we are, I think, is that's a good thing. I mean, that's something we don't want to suppress. And I think when we assume, we get comfortable. And when you get comfortable, you stop growing. You stop expanding. And this has put me on upside down, Greg, your book, and I absolutely love it. Like we said, we're both familiar with my hometown, Boulder, Colorado. You go up there much. I grew up in this awareness, yet this has turned me upside down from my education, even in the secular school system in Boulder, the land of the fruit, flakes, and nuts.
Well, Boulder, one of the highest per capita educated population in the country right now.
I call it not a fault, but when you enter in, like you were talking about academia and even the evolution and the first deep truth, this academia world, gosh, it's their own worst enemy. You know, it's almost like their investment and their commitment to the belief system that they've invested in doesn't allow expansion and growth, like you pointed out in many different facts in the book.
That's so true. I was just with a live audience in Boynton Beach, Florida this last weekend. It was a full-day program on Saturday. And there were scientists in the audience. And there was a woman that came up during our lunch break who is an anthropologist and has a minor in archaeology. And when we talked about the discoveries of evolution, human evolution, what the new data is showing, and specifically the DNA data, she asked me a question, and I think it sums everything up. She goes, how come I don't know about this? How come, I'm a teacher, she said, how come I don't know about this? The references are there in the peer-reviewed journals. It just is not being carried in mainstream in a way, and there typically is a lag time between new discoveries and when it gets into the public, a lag time, sometimes 6 to 8, maybe 10 years. The problem with that is that the crises we're facing are so big, we don't have 6 or 8 or 10 years. We need to disseminate these discoveries, and the places where there's a resistance to share them. I think that the general public is overcoming the resistance that has been put in place by the structure of the school board or whatever that structure is. So for me, the key is to stick with the facts, to be honest, to be truthful, to be responsible in the way I share these. So these aren't my opinions. These are the facts that are being shown today, and the context of where we find ourselves in our lives in the world is what makes these facts so vital. It changes everything about the way we think of ourselves. So Jake, I want to thank you for the opportunity today and the time to spend with you and our listeners.
Have a wonderful day, Greg. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us.
I'm off to my next interview, and Jake, so I'll see you in just a few weeks.
Sounds great. Look forward to it, Greg. Take care.
All right. Me as well. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.